Hello and welcome to the first ever Grimmfest podcast. We're here at the Plaza. I'm Rachel Richardson-Jones, Director of Grimmfest, and I'm here with Simeon Halligan, Director of Grimmfest, who is going to introduce our guests.
Well, actually, what I thought I'd do is ask you guys to introduce yourselves. But first off, just to say, we are a little over halfway through our J Horror Day. It's Halloween 2021, and we are very excited to be putting on this event, which has been supported by the BFI and their Japanese season. So, obviously, being Grimmfest, we decided the obvious thing to do would be to a J Horror Day. So we've screened 4 movies today, or will have done by the time we reach about 9:30. Tetsuo the Iron Man, Audition, Dark Water, and One Cut of the Dead. So our guests here today are all doctors and are all part of the...
soon to be doctors.
Okay, all right. Not all quite all doctors, but there you go. Are all kind of connected to or part of the Manchester Centre of Gothic Studies at the MMU in Manchester. So, guys, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Leonie Rowland. I'm the soon-to-be doctor. I've just started my PhD with the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies. I'm supervised by Linnie Blake, who is sitting across the table from me. And I'm working on the Japanese Gothic, J-horror, and something called commodity animism, which is basically people being attacked by objects and occasionally going on dates with them.
I am that Linnie Blake that is supervising that wonderful PhD. I founded the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies in, I think it was 2012, it came out of my head, and then in 2013 I was joined by my 2 fabulous colleagues who are sitting here, Xavi and Sorcha. I'm a film critic. I work predominantly on horror cinema and the Gothic, and I'm particularly interested in the political underpinnings of horror and the ways in which horror explores the kind of wider reaches of human experience, whether that be social or psychological.
I'm Sorcha Line. I'm another one of the Gothic Collective at Manchester Metropolitan University. I'm a senior lecturer in film studies. I specialise in American cinema predominantly and popular culture. Most of my work is looking at the political ideological framing of contemporary Hollywood understandings in cinema, and I'm particularly interested in popular horror culture, popular vampire culture, and looking at how we continually return to those iconic monsters through adaptation in cinematic discourse.
Hello everyone, my name is Xavier Aldana Reyes. I am a reader in English literature and film, and I am also a member of the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies. I am an expert in Gothic cinema, and although I don't necessarily work on Japanese horror, often I'm a body horror enthusiast, and I'm here to talk about the ways in which the films that we're looking at today engage with socio-political and historical notions from a Japanese context.
Well, where do we start? Actually, we did a panel in front of an audience a little earlier, so I guess really we should cover some of the same ground for this podcast. Would you like to start?
Yeah, so we have been talking about the ways in which the first 3 films that have been screened today, which are Tetsuo, Audition and Dark Water, straddle the rise and fall of Japan's bubble economy, and the kind of aggressive disaster capitalist tendencies that propelled Japan into this very extreme version of capitalism that fostered an almost aggressive capitalist consumption of various parts of society and also in various parts of society. And with Tetsuo, it came out in 1989, which was the sort of pinnacle of the bubble economy. Japan was thriving, and there was a lot of anxiety in the wider world about what this meant in terms of Japan's position, especially in relation to America, which kind of caused this to happen in the first place, but then became very threatened by it. So the way that Tetsuo interacts with this is predominantly in terms of the salaryman, who was the sort of figurehead of Japanese capitalism, consumer culture, and also masculinity at the time. And in Tetsuo, you kind of see the salaryman brought to his knees and turned into something that should be a sign of progress in terms of the mechanical nature of his transformation, that also has relations to the atomic body and the way that bodies were ravaged by nuclear weapons following the Second World War. So there's this kind of tension between the very progressive, supposedly prosperous workplace and then the national trauma and decay that lies underneath it. And then if you skip to Dark Water and Audition, which came out at the turn of the millennium, the preoccupations are much more to do with the culture of loneliness that stemmed out of the collapse of Japan's bubble economy. So people not having time to form proper human connections because they've been thrust into this very precarious work environment and kind of being conditioned to prioritize consumption over connection. And you also have the woman presented as sort of the figurehead of Japan and an embodiment of the nation, but also a real source of serious national and specifically masculine anxiety, which came from women entering into the workplace and consequently deciding that they don't want to enter into the more conservative gender roles that were previously imposed upon them and that are still imposed upon them in the present day. I don't know if Linnie wants to expand on that.
I think Linnie does.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what we said in the panel, and whether we want to say it again.
Well, of course you can, because the people listening to this will be probably different people. Maybe
People. No, of course.
I mean, I was just going to say what struck me about Audition was a sense of absolute frustration on the way women are treated in that society. As, you know, a sense that must stem back through generations, and this was kind of like, sorry, barging in, but anyway, you go.
No, it wasn't that. I just kept trying to turn it towards you. Yeah, I mean, the depiction of women in Japanese cinema is always problematic. Because the position of women in Japanese culture is always problematic, and this isn't unique to the Japanese by any shape or form, but I think to a European audience, when these films first came out, you know, turn of the millennium, I, for one, because I did watch them as cinematic releases, I am that old and older, I was very struck at the ways in which women are centred in one of several ways. Women are either fetishised victims, and there is, let's face it, we've all seen those Stacey Dooley documentaries on the BBC. There is a culture of fetishisation, particularly of problematically young women in Japanese culture, and there is a kind of degree of acceptance of what we would consider to be entirely beyond the pale pornographic representation of women in a variety of degrading and fetishised ways. And I was very struck when I first saw these movies by the kind of spin that they have on difficult gender relations in Japan. Certainly the films we've seen, Tetsuo is all of those things. It's obviously its central character is male, but you know that too is a gender, and gender is problematic in Japanese cinema. What happens to the body of the man in Tetsuo is in many ways allegorical of what's happened to Japanese society at the hands of mechanised consumer capitalism, and the entrenchment of the salaryman figure, and the destruction that does to him as an individual, but also to more sort of sane models of gender relations in Japan. Audition has a vengeful female, spiritish character. Dark Water similarly problematises the figure of the single parent in Japanese culture. And One Cut of the Dead is kind of something else entirely, but it does have a kind of comedic engagement with the history of Japanese cinema. So yes, I mean, gender is always problematic. There are certain Japanese films, particularly the Pinku films from the 1960s, that are profoundly pornographic. There are horror movies such as the Guinea Pig movies that are essentially a guy dressed up as a Second World War Japanese officer taking a woman apart. And there are films like Dark Water, which is a sustained and very sensitive meditation on the difficulties of being a woman in Japan. But I don't think it's possible to ignore the centrality of female representation in Japanese cinema, because being a Japanese woman is difficult. It's always been difficult, historically a feudal culture in which women had very clearly defined gender roles. And then under capitalism, the kind of almost 19th century division of labour occurred. Women in the home, men in the corporation. And then, of course, with the coming of the bubble economy, women's roles changed. There were more public figures. But there's something of a kind of backlash you see in these movies against, you certainly see it in Audition. There's a misogynistic conversation that occurs in a bar room when the main protagonist and his best mate sort of bemoan not only the culture of loneliness in Japan, but the horror of having women in what had been traditionally male spaces. All of this, I think, and I am aware I am going on a little bit here, I will stop after this. All of this, I think, bespeaks, as Leonie said, a culture of trauma that lies very deep in the Japanese psyche and that is traditionally represented through female figures. Everyone is familiar with the figure of the Onryo, the Sadako figure from the Ringu movies, the vengeful spirit that comes back to revisit her vengeance, and indeed in the Suzuki Koji novel on which it's based, that comes back to wreak vengeance upon not necessarily those who have actually destroyed or repressed her, but on whoever's nearest. And we see this in various forms. It bespeaks a traumatic Japanese history, a Japanese history of feudalism, and then an attempt to colonise East Asia, and then of course themselves being colonised following the twin horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the Americans, who ripped up the traditional Japanese constitution and instituted a system of corporate capitalist democracy, which theoretically enshrined things like the rights of workers and the rights of women, but in many ways, retrenched a lot of unequal power structures. So all of the films we see coming out of Japan, and this is true of any culture, are products of their time, their place, and their history. And central to all of that is the problematic status of women, both as victim and in the aftermath of the bubble economy, as aggressor, as just one other thing that is setting out to destroy Japanese men.
You talked earlier on when we were on the panel. We were talking about it was really interesting. Some of the things that you said struck me that I hadn't thought about before in terms of how their history obviously affected the kind of movies that they've made at certain times. But I wondered, you're talking about obviously the aftermath of the Second World War, and I mentioned, and we all discussed a little bit about how a lot of their really successful horror films seem to deal with technology, but also deal with their tradition and their myths and their legends, and they very successfully combine those things together in a way that many other countries have not managed to achieve with their genre and horror movies. But it occurred to me, and I don't know if you've got anything to say about this, that change between the traditional Japanese historical stuff that we see in Kurosawa movies and things like that, and more contemporary westernized society that they live in. Was that a very quick change, much quicker than other countries, do you think? Is there something to be said for that kind of clash between the old and the new? Did that happen more quickly than in other places, or?
Well, yeah, it happened overnight. I mean, with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you are looking at the fall of an imperial system. And whilst the emperor remained in post, so to speak, he ceased to be a god. And that's very important, to declare the head of state, who had traditionally been divine as simply a man, marked, you know, the end of an era of Japanese intrinsic nativist Japanese history. Japan became in many ways a satellite state of America, economically and indeed culturally. It's no coincidence, as I said on the panel, that Japan's national game is baseball. Yeah. Nobody's national game is baseball apart from the United States of America. So yes, and this resulted in a massive backlash in the 1950s at the hands of people like Yukio Mishima, who were, you know, right-wing traditionalist men who believed that Japan had essentially been emasculated by MacArthur and by the legislative changes. There was a massive program of what was called de-Nipponization, which was essentially removing from Japan any of those symbols that may have caused people to rally around the Japanese flag. It was illegal to depict Mount Fuji, for example. Wow. It was necessary in the same way as the Americans set about bombing those two cities into dust. So did they attempt to bomb the history and culture and feudal emperor worshipping state of the nation into nothingness, and to build it up again in the image of American democratic capitalism. It's a recipe, it's not dissimilar to what we've seen in Iraq, for example. It's a recipe for cultural confusion and indeed political backlash.
I feel like some of their movies, some of their horror movies seem to kind of, you feel like there is some of that past seeping through into the contemporary society through technology sometimes, like Ringo with the tape, the VHS tape, but it's also connecting to their past somehow.
Oh, absolutely, because you can only repress stuff for so long. You know, if Uncle Sigmund taught us nothing, it's the fact that you can tamp it all down. Yes. But as Dark Water shows us, it seeps into the spaces that are left behind, and the stains it leaves, on your psyche, on your nation, on the national consciousness. You're never going to get those out with a coat of capitalist paint.
What I love about horror in general, but particularly in this conversation, look at Japanese horror, is that a lot of people that don't appreciate horror don't realise the political context of it quite often. And when listening to you talk about this, you very quickly realise how important the genre is in terms of its reflecting society and the issues and concerns of society in Japan.
Absolutely.
And Sorcha, and just because I think from the panel, I felt that we all had a lot to say, and you guys had a lot to say, certainly about women within Japanese horror. I want to kind of bring it back to some of those points that you made on the panel.
Sure, no problem. So one of the things that we were talking about in the panel was to think about the changing nature, I suppose, of women in Japanese society, and this very much comes to the fore in some of the late 1990s, early 2000s horror movies coming out of Japan, whether it is looking at the idea of single parenthood in particular. You see that in Ringo, you see that in Dark Water, and this anxiety about the single professional woman and how she is up against not only necessarily the patriarchal restrictions within sort of a failing, crumbling marriage, but equally the economic precarity that comes out of single parenthood as well, and that terror of passing that on, that sense of isolation, that palpable loneliness, that uphill struggle that women have, how that can be passed on, whether it's through something like having to confront a sort of an ancient curse in something like Ringu, but more to the point in Dark Water, we see that as something that is terrifying in terms of its ability to be a hereditary kind of curse through the children in that. The film, I think Dark Water in particular, really looks at that anxiety as something that it takes itself or finds expression in not only the architecture of the film and the crumbling buildings, but also through the lead character, how she is coping with this and how the world is literally dissolving around her. Her sense of stability in the world is incredibly fragile, and the space in which her child, and of course the haunting that occurs within the apartment block, that all in itself reinforces this horror. Something I forgot to mention in the panel, so I'm definitely going to mention it now, is the fact that we get the space, the architectural space in Dark Water. One of the things that is really interesting about that is that it happens in apartment 305, and the leak comes in from the 4th floor, and traditionally in Japanese buildings you don't have a 4th floor, or at least it's not acknowledged on their elevators because it's so close, the symbol is so close to the word death. So we get this really interesting erasure of the fourth floor, like you have in American
So
culture.
they really
where you
don't have a full floor?
Yeah, in American culture you don't see a 13th floor in a building either, so it's a similar kind of thing.
Right.
The other thing is you don't tend to see nines either, because 9 is close to the word pain. So it was really interesting to see that there are these spaces within the film, the architectural spaces, where there are blanks and numbers that are jumped over because they seem to be so sources of anxiety, superstitious anxiety perhaps, but anxiety nonetheless within the cultural terrain. So I think the architecture of that film really maps on not only to the sense of how do you navigate a world in a post-precarious, post-divorce space that is literally crumbling around you. How do you keep your grip on the world while you're trying to raise a small child in this really desolate representation of Tokyo? But equally so then these spaces are navigable then by cultural senses that are not necessarily logical, but very much informing how we navigate the world as well. So I think there was a really interesting kind of architecture in the film that's at work that takes it out on the female character in a really, really interesting way. So there you go.
Xavi, let's come on to you, because you brought up some incredibly insightful thoughts in the panel.
Well, I think Sorcha raises a couple of really interesting ideas there. One has to do with the urban landscapes of quite a lot of Japanese.
I was about to mention that.
Yeah, they're very interesting. So some people say it begins with 1982's Burst City, which is normally set to be the first cyberpunk Japanese film, and the emphasis on that film is very much on the punk. You know, it's very much a musical film about anger and sort of urban desolation. But what really stuck from that film was the muted color palette, and a lot of Japanese horror has that sort of toned down quality to it that brings out the feelings of isolation, desolation. Sort of post-industrial rust is how I like to think of it, and it really comes across beautifully in the Tetsuo films, but also in later and even earlier cyberpunk films. I'm thinking of something like Death Powder, or what's the other one? 964 Pinocchio, which those of you in the audience, it's insane. If you think you couldn't watch anything more insane than Tetsuo, you haven't watched Pinocchio 964. It's truly insane. Don't blame me if you don't watch it and have nightmares. But what strikes me really, about these films is how that landscape really is saying something about the Japanese ambiguity when it comes to technology, their relationship to technology. It's a country that is, has always been at the forefront, at the vanguard of technological development. And a film like Tetsuo is a good example of that. Pre-digitally, post-industrial, pre-digital, literally junkyard scrap metal fantasies of. I think at the end of the film, the melding of the salaryman and the metal fetishes. They start saying things like, "Now we will turn the whole world into metal." Which of course resonates with the history of Tokyo and its expansion and so on. But what it leads to... Oh, sorry, yeah.
Sorry, no, also of the symbol of Hiroshima,
yes.
Right at the start, that metal dome, that survived, whereas people were reduced to shadows on walls and to dust. Do you think, I didn't know anything about this muted palette business, do you think that's why Gore Verbinski in his adaptation of Ringo to Ring adopted that muted colour palette in a contemporary sequel?
Very possibly. It's also likely that the aesthetics of the early cyberpunks, which, were that way by necessity. So Tetsuo is recorded, 16mm. Death Powder, is very much amateur, very low budget, shoestring budget films. And that then seeps into the aesthetic of future films, which are actively trying to recreate that. So that I also think is quite interesting, because Japanese cinema, we saw a revival of art house cinema in the 1990s, partly thanks to Tetsuo and how well it did critically in the UK. Obviously, largely in the video market, because it was only screened to art house cinemas initially. But I think that seeps through and becomes part of the makeup, really, of the films that come after. And I think the one that strikes me as particularly significant is Akira, the anime from 1988. People might not know this, but Tetsuo takes his name from the character, the villain in Akira, who is also this melding of flesh and metal. I think that stays in Japanese horror, but takes the shape of digital technology. So, and this is, it starts with analog and Ringu and so on, but it definitely moves into digital. One Mist Call and all those other films that followed. Cairo in particular, which is very much ahead of its time, and it kind of is saying everything that critics of social media are saying about social media before it even existed, right? Yeah. It's saying about how this technology that is meant to bring us together, really very much like people living in big urban metropolises, it can actually just end up in the complete opposite. Atomization of people. I think there's a beautiful image in Cairo of a computer screen with white dots, never sort of travelling along but never quite meeting each other. I think that is what Japanese horror brought to the table very early on.
It's interesting you say that, though, as well, about the moving of the palette as well, because even in the American remakes, we do find they tend to be located in places that simulate the climate that you get in Japan. I'm thinking of Seattle, for instance, in the Gore Verbinski ring, which again very much looks at that rainy slate grey colour palette that we expect out of Dark Water, out of Ringu, that kind of climate where it's the closest you kind of really get to approximate it on the American mainland. So I find that really fascinating that they're trying to mimic in some ways that sense of decay and that sense of isolation and just decrepitude that comes through in the climate and that extreme that you get in the climate in Japan.
Seattle's a great city for that, though, isn't it? Because you're also looking at a kind of bubble economy city. Yes. And a city that's so massively socially polarised, between the kind of, big shiny buildings down on the waterfront. And then you've got documentary movies like Streetwise depicting, the plight of homeless kids. Yes, indeed.
I wanted to ask you, I've said on the panel about, I was wondering why we all think that J-horror was so successful in the West and particularly in the UK. And I was saying about how I remember in the 90s and 2000s that Tartan Video were a big label for J-horror, and that's probably where I got to see a lot of these movies first. But it's interesting, though, because when I look back at that period, we weren't seeing lots of successful horror movies from lots of other countries, apart from America, of course, which we've always been, obsessed with their stuff. But from other parts of the world, Japan seemed to be the one that we became a little bit obsessed with in that era. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about why that was.
Well, to me, it felt like it was because of the American horror cinema of the late 1990s. It felt a little bit jaded. It was self-cannibalizing itself through postmodern referentiality in the post-Scream world, essentially. We felt that, we've seen it all before, and we can be a bit
comes
smug.
Out very soon.
Exactly, the new one's coming out in January. But we felt very smug and safe, I suppose, in that, and we didn't, anything that was sort of seen as sort of B-class or would have been cult viewing would have been, again, consumed through videotape, so we would have had that sense of control and mastery on it and known what to expect within the kind of realms of censorship. So then you get something like Tartan Extreme and these really exciting films that come out in the late 1990s, and we get to experience them, and they feel a little bit unsafe. We don't feel as sure of them in terms of their national politics, in terms of their aesthetics, in terms of the limits that we're going to see on screen, and literally the fact that they're straplined with the word extreme, you kind of think, okay, this is going to be a bit of an adventure, and they just do not, they resonate and they have a power that we might feel a bit jaded with American cinema or even British cinema, but in the sense of Japanese imagery, we're not quite on the same national footing, so therefore I do think it has confrontational images that we're not expecting and that we don't have a full nuanced understanding of. It gives us that sense of urgency.
But I just wondered why in particular Japanese movies, Japanese kind of extreme horror, rather than other countries in that.
So I think that Japanese horror tackles loneliness in a way that not many other horror traditions have achieved. And Japan's been experiencing what people call a culture of loneliness since the 1980s, 90s, even as far back as the 1970s, depending on how you look at it. And I think they have this innate eating melancholy that really taps into something quite gentle, even when it's expressed in a very extreme, often excessively violent way. I know that sounds like a paradox, but I thought that what Xavi was saying about the city is also really interesting, because a lot of the aesthetic, for this reason, kind of trends towards dystopia, even when it's not conventional dystopia. And you're seeing in Japan, Tokyo, the biggest metropolis in the world, it's a city where light is quite easily blocked out. You're walking down a street and it gets dark, but the artificial light floods it, so you don't really notice. And I think that, to take that into a kind of metaphorical realm, you see that in a lot of J-horror on the level of communication between people and conceptions of the self, like both in terms of understanding where you fit into a national body and where you fit into your own home when you walk through the front door, in terms of the nuclear family collapsing and it no longer, like the home as a physical space is unsettled and shifting. So yeah, I wonder if that's some of the reason why.
For me, I've just, as you were talking about it, and I was thinking about, for me, from a visual perspective and from a filmmaker perspective, I think that I'm trying to think about British horror compared to Japanese horror, and what we were watching in the 90s and 2000s, and what we were being influenced by, and I just get this sense about British horror is that we've always been obsessed with the other, as in folk horror, and horror was out there in the forest or out there, traditionally we very rarely, maybe it's changed a little bit now, but until recently we very rarely made horror that was kind of set in an urban environment. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that most of the films that I'm thinking of that have become popular over this last 30 years of J-horror are generally set in urban environments. So maybe that was something a little different for us. I mean, I suppose if you look at something like Nightmare on Elm Street, it's set in an urban environment. Suburban environment, yeah. But a lot of, you think about Dark Water, and it's not where you expect to set a ghost story. Traditionally, we set them in big old haunted houses. And they set these things in decaying contemporary spaces. That go for it.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I was rambling anyway.
That's what we do for a living. I think if you're looking at British horror, you can't divorce that from the history of Gothic and horror literature.
Sure, yeah.
So in many ways, whilst the 18th century Gothic novel may have established a series of sets and settings, the ruined monastery, the ancient castle, you also have through the 19th century the emergence of the city as not just a locale but almost a protagonist in horror. You look at Jekyll and Hyde, for example, in the city itself. Yeah. So there was a slower there was a slower evolution of the spaces of horror in the UK because we had a history in which things evolved more slowly. We were at the heart of empire in London, and obviously there was the horror that went on out there. But there was a great deal of fear of what might happen if the things that went on out there come back to haunt us. So you get Dracula, all the way over there on the other side of the Carpathians coming back and, despoiling the pure bourgeois maidens of the English middle classes. Yeah. All of that stuff going on. Japanese history, as we've talked about, has been accelerated. It's been hyper-accelerated. And it went straight from a culture of feudalism to a culture of capitalism. And then, with neoliberalism, the massive acceleration of that to free market capitalism. Yeah. So the urban space is the only place in which horror can happen, because the urban space is the only place that people can now live. Yes, there are, of course, there are rural places in Japan, but land has always been at a premium. And you may get, say, in Ringu, where they go out to a lodge in the hills, but, it's a couple of hours' drive from the city, etc. So, the city itself becomes the site and the subject of horror because it embodies the terrors of hyper-capitalism in the modern age. But it's also, as it falls apart, perfectly positioned to encapsulate them.
I'm just wondering whether we hadn't really seen that much of that back then.
Well, I am going to stop us right there for J-Horror Part 1. I thank our guests so much for spending the day with us and
absolute pleasure, thank you.
Giving us all your knowledge, and very much hope that you'll come back and we'll do Part 2. So thank you very much, everyone.
Yay.